So, all of us come into the spiritual life with different views or different ideas about pleasure and the spiritual life. And we'll find ourselves on a spectrum. So, some of us will have an idea about the spiritual life that it's all about pleasure, a kind of image of the spiritual life of walking through fields barefoot, taking in sunsets and standing under waterfalls and feeling blessed. And then others, we will have a different idea about the spiritual life. We'll think it's all about renunciation, it's all about giving things up and living more and more simply, and that any pleasures that do come out of the spiritual life are going to be rather anemic or sterile as compared to the pleasures that we might get through worldly pleasures or achievements. So both of these views will have limitations. If we think that the spiritual life is all about giving things up, then what we risk is never taking a leap of faith that will allow us to open up to much greater fulfillment and much greater pleasure and bliss than anything we will ever get out of worldly achievements or worldly affairs. So for some of us, if it sounds like give things up now and you'll go to heaven later, that might just not land. So we'll just have to start by taking small steps and opening up to an experience for ourselves of the pleasures that the spiritual life might offer. On the other hand, if we think that with the spiritual life, it's all about bliss and it's all about pleasure, the risk is that we don't really face up to the reality that all of our experience will have an element of dissatisfaction, even the pleasurable ones. And that if we're really honest with ourselves, there is often a humdrum of negativity, a sort of quantum of negativity or tension or dissatisfaction in the background of our experience. So what that can look like is finally making it to the weekend getaway, but in the back of our minds, not quite being able to park the crisis at work or the tension at home that is continuously playing on our mind. So we'll have to be able to face up and be aware of that being part of the spiritual life as well, of facing of all of our experience, including the dissatisfactory aspect that will pervade all of it. So to start with, what we can look at when it comes to Buddhism and the spiritual life is what Buddhism is actually aiming for. And what Buddhism is actually aiming for is enlightenment. Enlightenment as an experience that goes beyond the self and other dichotomy through which we experience the world, and would open us up to an experience that is far beyond what we could imagine. And to start off on that path, to start off with that vision, what we can start by doing is recognizing that as a starting point, as human beings, the way that we're wired is that we tend to indeed orient our lives around pleasure as much as possible. So pleasure to distract ourselves from the pain of our experience or just the tedium of ordinary consciousness, or just to shore up our emotional life and to regulate our emotions. Knowing that our experience is unpleasant or neutral in nature, add pleasurable experience on top of it in order to feel okay. And that's sort of fine in and of itself, but with Buddhism, what we're trying to do is move beyond that. So we're reorienting our lives around our highest ideals, even if that's uncomfortable at times, and not just orienting our lives around pleasure and creating a more pleasurable experience. When we actually ask ourselves what our heart wishes for, it won't actually to just have as pleasurable an experience as possible. It will be for something more like freedom or to live a more meaningful life. So that's what we're trying to reorient our lives around. The thing is, if we just give up pleasures and try to do without, it won't work. We're wired to need pleasure. We're wired to benefit from pleasure, just as human beings. So what we can start by doing is just looking at our strategies, our sources of pleasures. So what we can do on that basis is give up the more unwholesome sources of pleasures. So maybe drugs or alcohols or parties that lead us to stay up late and harm our bodies in certain ways. We recognize that that's not always good for us, not always having a positive effect on the world around us. And we can drop that, but not just leave a sort of void. Instead, what we can do is turn towards more wholesome sources of pleasure. For example, friendship, spending time in nature, or engaging in creative practices. So that's the starting point. We give up the unwholesome pleasures and we turn towards more wholesome sources of pleasure. And once we've done that, pleasure is no longer the problem. Instead, it becomes more about how we engage with pleasure. So the Buddhist view isn't that life is suffering in the sense of there is no joy or pleasure in the spiritual life. What the Buddhist view is that there's going to be a variety of stimuli or sensations in our life, pain, pleasure, and neutral sensations. And with the pleasurable ones, the problem is that when we spoil them by grasping at them and hankering after them and just wanting more. And then we turn those pleasurable sensations into sources of suffering as well. So what we can do instead is work on our volitional response to pleasure, work on how we actually engage with pleasure. And a really good place for this is in meditation. So what we can notice is that our sort of baseline generic way that we're wired is to grab at pleasure and then to want more of it. And instead, to use a poetic term, what we're wanting to do is turn towards it with a soft gaze and then kiss the joy as it flies. So enjoy it while it lasts, but not grasp at it or grab at it as it is fleeting and ephemeral, which it always will be. So we can work on our volitional responses to pleasure in meditation. And when we sit down to meditate, actually what we will notice at first is that we can be very distracted, and a lot of the content of our distraction can be, broadly speaking, pushing away painful experiences and fantasizing about pleasure experiences or grabbing at pleasurable experiences or just wanting more of an intensity of pleasurable experience than the one that we have. So we can recognize that, gives the mind some time to settle, and then start working with the more subtle, sustainable sources of pleasure that we find in the body. So for example, the pleasure of the breath, the pleasure of the sensations in our hands, the pleasure of just being a breathing human being, and just enjoy that. And over time, if we marinate in that, if we dwell in that, the pleasure will deepen and it will expand. The thing is that once we do enter these states, what we'll realize is that even these states, as wholesome, as wonderful, as nourishing as they may be, will have their limitations as well. So we definitely do want to enter them. We definitely do want to dwell in them. And that can lead to all sorts of refinement of our consciousness. And to that extent, so psychological entanglement, an ability to simplify our lives and give up what is no longer serving us because we're in touch with a deep well of inner resource and riches. That's all great stuff, but we will also notice the limitations of these pleasurable states. The first one is that even the most pleasurable states at some point start to have diminishing returns. It's like there's only so much pleasure the psychophysical organism can take. It's kind of like going to the gallery and at some point, after enjoying lots of beautiful images, just wanting to go sit in the cafe or just really wanting to go after work after a holiday. There's only so much pleasure that our organism can take. So what we can do is recognize that it's not all about pleasure. The second thing that we can do is just notice that these states are always ephemeral, impermanent. What we want to do is use the clarity of mind, the purity of mind, the brightness of mind that we've cultivated to turn the mind towards reality. So we've gotten into these pleasurable states, maybe we've let go of a certain degree of discursive thought. That's the basis upon which we'll be able to turn our minds towards wisdom reflections like impermanence, suffering, and insubstantiality. And not only have an intellectual understanding of them, but an actual seeing of them. An emotional equivalent to the intellectual understanding will rise on the basis of really seeing these truths for what they are. And that's what's going to allow us to transform our whole being and eventually pierce into the nature of reality itself at that point of no return, and eventually arrive at the point of enlightenment, which is said to be the great bliss. So at some point, what we'll realize is that this unquenched thirst that we have for fulfillment won't be fulfilled by just more pleasure, even spiritual pleasure, even the pleasure of meditation. But the place for that is that will allow us to have a mind that is clear and pure and bright enough to turn towards the Buddhist teachings, to turn towards the truth of things. And that will allow us to follow in the Buddhist footsteps, to move towards the Buddha, to move towards the enlightened mind, which is the great bliss that we're all really searching for.